Hello and welcome to Introduction to Apologetics and Philosophy, lesson number 3. Today we're going to be covering some basic definitions in philosophy, especially if we want to understand ancient philosophy. And then we are also going to venture on to looking at the pre-Socratic philosophers, what their thoughts were, what their ideas were, and how they have shaped and impacted the rest of philosophy. The pre-Socratic philosophers would be all of those philosophers that existed before the great Socrates. So let's go into it. Let's look at some definitions here. It's very important for us to understand what we mean when we speak, how we define terms, what we're trying to say, how we're trying to get our ideas across. There's a very interesting word or term that gets used quite a bit nowadays, and this word is myth. Typically, in the general sense, when we speak about a myth, it's the idea that there's a made-up story, as if the story is fake. Now, this is not the way that it is used in scholarships, because a myth could be a true story of sorts, or it is conveying truth in the meta-narrative sense of the word. But maybe all the details of that story are not factual. Maybe there's some poetry involved within that. Well, ancient Greek thinkers thought and understood this, and this is the way they lived in their society. So a mythos would have been an attempt to explain something true, something real, by telling a story. Number 2, we look at the word logos or logos, which is essentially the foundation of the word logic or logikos. It is an attempt to give a reason or to give reasons. An argument usually refers to the logical order of things. Sometimes this word is translated as defense. Sometimes this word is translated as word, especially in the New Testament. Sometimes it is translated as reason. Number 3, material monist or material monism. A material monist would be an individual who believes in material monism. Is the view that something as formed by a single element. So this describes the search for a fundamental substance. The idea here would be that everything, when you boil it down to a most fundamental substance. It is made of one thing, but that thing is material. It is not a non-material substance. It is a material one. And finally, philosophical monotheism. Philosophical monotheism is the idea that there exists, or the existence of a one all-powerful and all-knowing God who has no visible form and engages in no physical activity. This is very important because philosophical monotheism here would be different from Christian monotheism. Christian monotheism or Jewish monotheism is generally the idea that there's only one God who interacts with the physical universe, with the physical world. This philosophical monotheistic God actually does not interact. And some would venture to say cannot, or it would be impossible for this God to interact with the physical world, predominantly because they believe the physical world is a world in which there is evil, a world in which things aren't perfect. Moving on with some definitions, we look at the word skepticism, or the definition of skepticism. And this is the view that it is impossible for us to know anything for certain. After that, we're looking at perception. Perception is a word that gets used quite a bit. This is the state of being aware of something through the senses. It is a way of regarding, understanding, or interpreting something. This is a mental impression. So if I look outside and I see a green tree, I perceive the greenness of the tree. I perceive the tree itself. And so therefore I am interpreting, or I am having a mental impression of something that is taking place. So it's an interpretation of events. So philosophers will use this language quite often by saying, I perceive this, or I perceive that. And finally, the word truth. Truth has had many different definitions, will probably have many different definitions, people kind of try to boil it down and give you a more accurate, more detailed definition of what truth is. But here, we're going to look at it in its maybe ancient form and something that Aristotle said. So according to the oldest conception of truth, made famous by Aristotle, and here's what it says. Truth is to say of what is that it is. Truth is to say of what is that it is, and to say of what is not that it is not. And this to him is to speak truly or truthfully. To say of what a thing is that it is, and to say of what is not that it is not. This is a map of the ancient world that we looked at in our second lesson. And what we're going to focus on is a good amount of these ancient pre-Socratic philosophers come from where Asia Minor is, not Greece proper. We're used to thinking about Athens as the place of philosophical thought and development. But for this section, at least, we're going to be looking, at least some of the more famous ones, some of the earlier ones, at a town called Miletus or Miletus. And the first individual we're going to look at is Thales of Miletus. Thales would be considered to be maybe the first philosopher. Okay, and this is the individual who first sought a rational explanation for natural occurrences. You might even think he's the first scientist because he is trying to find a rational explanation for natural occurrences. And so he became the first person to attempt to rationally explain the universe. Predominantly, the question that he was asking is, what is the world made of? What really exists? What doesn't exist? And you might remember that this would fall into the branch of philosophy called metaphysics, because we are looking at what really exists and what could be known about existence. But he was also concerned about what the world is made up of. Now, he concluded that the basic substance that the world is made up of is water. And I'm going to go back a slide and show you a map of where Miletus is. And you can tell that Miletus is very close to a great deal of water. And maybe it would be the case that it was rational to think that everything was made of water. Not necessarily because of what you saw in regards to the sea, the Aegean Sea in this case, but when you woke up in the morning, there would be water on everything. When you squeeze things, think about fruits, think about your clothing. When we get hot, we sweat. There's water essentially coming out of most things, most if not all things. And so I think it would have been rational for Thales to look at this and say, maybe the most fundamental substance that everything is made up of is water. Now we move on to look at this individual, Anaximander. Anaximander is also from Miletus, and he thought the primary element that everything is made up of is indeterminate. And this indeterminate thing is where everything comes from. So we can't really say what it is. From this thing, this apeiron, come opposites, come hot and cold, come life and death, come growth and decay. So anything that has an opposite, right? So it would be the positive and the negative of that thing. So he thought that life comes from the sea. This is another thing he thought, and this was, you could say, revolutionary. And some people like to think that he might be the first person to stumble upon this idea of evolution. I don't tend to think that this is really evolution, but it's pretty close. And he thought that life comes from the sea, or life came from the sea. And he had this idea that life came by a means of adaptation to the environment. It's not the idea that that life came from the sea that is most like evolution. It is the idea that it is by means of adaptation to your environment that life kind of arose. Okay? So the present form of animals were developed depending on their environment. Way ahead of its time. The next individual we're going to be looking at is Anaximenes. Anaximenes is also from Miletus. And he thought that the basic element is not water. It's not this indeterminate thing, but it is air. So everything is made of air and comes from air. The only difference is the density of the air. And one of the examples that he gave, and one of the popular examples that you will come across when you read the literature, is when you blow air out with your mouth. And he says, when you open up wide and you blow air out, it's hot. And then when you close your mouth and you blow air out, it is cold. And that's because of the density. So everything's made of air. The only difference is density. And that's Anaximenes. The next individual we will look at is one that we have most likely heard his name, especially in mathematical circles, is Pythagoras. Pythagoras, as many might think, is not just a mathematician. As a matter of fact, he was more of a philosopher than he was a mathematician. Even his math was not only philosophically kind of undergirded and grounded, but also his mathematics had a religious kind of application to it. Pythagoras had a school of followers and students called the Pythagorean school. So he had a bunch of disciples who continued making disciples of other people. Now he believed that numbers are the ultimate reality. And part of the reason why he believes this is because he says numbers are perfect. They are predictable and unchanging. Think about it. 2 plus 2 is always 4, and you can predict that it is always 4. You don't need to doubt yourself. And he believed that the world consists of opposites, as did some of his predecessors. There's opposites going on. And then he created or established a school of thinking where mathematics is divine. It is a religion. It is beyond human. And I would say partly because of the order that comes within mathematics. By the way, just know that this is an introduction. When we go over these thinkers, there's plenty of them, and we got to look at their ideas. So we're not going into in-depth studies of these individuals. Some of them we can't even really go into the in-depth studies because we don't have much material either that they wrote or that other people wrote about them. It's just generally we can put together whatever it was that they taught, some of the main ideas of their teachings, their names, and where they were from. Let's add some more definitions. And there's two that we're going to add here. One is a paradox, and the other one is an atomist or atomism. A paradox, as opposed to a contradiction, is a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that when investigated or explained may prove to be well-founded or true. So, opposed to a self-contradiction is contradictory, it's always wrong. But a paradox appears to be contradictory or absurd. But when you look at all the details, it comes out to be well-founded and true. Atomism is the idea that there are an infinite number of indivisible units, which are called atoms. Now, be very careful not to think about this in the modern sense of the word, even though obviously there are similarities. These are important since they are so small. These atoms differ in size and shape and move around in the void. The movement is self-existent, so it doesn't need a cause or a reason for its movements. And atomism was something that was developed within this time period. The next individual we're going to be looking at is Xenophanes. Xenophanes casts doubt on the notion of the gods. And some people actually like to think about Xenophanes as maybe the first atheist. So he was against the Greek gods. But he wasn't really an atheist, especially not in the modern sense of the word. But he just didn't believe in the Greek gods. So he's the first one to challenge the mythos. The Greek gods, by the way, I think it's pretty obvious when you look at the ancient record that individuals did not think that you're going to climb Mount Olympus and, find Zeus sitting there. And plenty of people, especially individuals who thought hard and long about these things, understood that these were stories meant to convey a certain truth. So they were mythos in that kind of a sense of the word. But he's the first one to challenge the mythos. He's the first one to challenge these stories. And he says his main issue is that when we imagine the gods, we imagine them like ourselves. We imagine them to be like us. And the gods or God cannot be like us. Because when you look at Greek mythology, you realize that the gods have a bunch of the same issues that the human beings have. So he proposes this philosophical monotheism. And one of the things that he proposes is that the gods or God should be morally good. And this moral goodness and this perfection goes beyond that. It's not just moral goodness, but there's a perfection that is the case in the sense that there's so much perfection where it would be impossible for this being to interact with the physical world. The next individual is Heraclitus. And Heraclitus believed that the world is governed by the Logos. And the Logos is a universal law. The Logos is universal, where all material substances are held in balance. They are held together. Now, everything exists in tension. So this goes back to this idea of opposites. So everything is held within a tension. And everything is a part of some process. Something is happening. Something is taking place. And so there's a unity that is brought together within the opposites that we have spoken about. There's something that brings these opposites together, right? Kind of like this idea that opposites attract. Think of magnets. Think of day and night. You need both of them. But one of the maybe most important contribution that he brings about is that he says the universe or the world is governed by the Logos, this reason, this beyond maybe our realm thing that governs and rules, this universal law that is there. Next individual is Parmenides. Parmenides said that all is one and change is impossible. Change is an illusion. So this comes from the premise that it is. He can deduce that it cannot be, it is not. What he means here is that we can only talk about things that exist. We can't talk about negatives. We can't talk about things in the sense that they are not or it is not. So we can only talk about what is, the what isness about something. So let's just give an example here. If we were talking about God, we would not be able to say what God is not, what generally is called negative theology, by the way, but rather we would be talking about what God is. So maybe we would say something like, God is morally good. Zeno, who is a phenomenal individual, is a defender of the teachings of Parmenides. And he says nothing changes. Change is an illusion like him. Except Zeno gave us some examples, maybe some experiments we could do, some thought experiments we could do to prove this. And so he demonstrates this by giving us two examples. One is of the runner, and both of these have to do with running, by the way. One is just called the runner, and the other one is the tortoise and Achilles. And the way that he sets this up is that he says, suppose a turtle and Achilles are in a race, and the turtle is ahead of Achilles. In the race, you would assume that Achilles would come and pass by the turtle because the turtle is too slow and eventually win the race. But he says, not so. Hang on here a little bit. For every distance that Achilles travels, the turtle travels a certain distance in front of him. So theoretically, the turtle is always ahead of Achilles, and Achilles never takes the race and wins the race. Now, this would be a paradox, he would say. The other example he gives is a runner who is traveling, let's say running from point A to point B, or let's say C. And he says, in between points A and C is point B. And in between point B and A is another point. Let's call it A prime. And between point A and A prime, there's another point. Let's call it A double prime. And between point A and point A double prime, there's another point. And you can see where this is going, where he says this is infinitely divisible. And so he says, the paradox is that the runner will never get to his destination, because in order for him to get to his destination, he has to travel half of that, and half of that, and half of that. So therefore, change is an illusion. Think about that traveling experiment or thought experiment, and remember it, because we're going to come to it when a certain version of it when we speak about the Kalam cosmological argument. And this is called the impossibility of traversing actual infinites. The next individual we're looking at is Empedocles. Now, Empedocles discovered and named the 4 components of life, or life as elements. And here are the elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And he says they all combine in different ways. And nothing really comes into or leaves existence. It's just a combination of 2 or more of these things. And he says the world exists because of necessity. So he did not believe that the universe or the world is contingent. It is a necessary sort of thing. And then he says things appear to change because of the combining and falling apart of these elements, right? Like I said, they appear to change. They don't really change, but they appear to change when these things are mixed together or when they fall apart. And then he explains this in sort of a mystical way. He says this is really done through love and strife. And we don't really know what this looks like, this love and strife sort of thing. Maybe you can think of it in the sense that love brings unity, brings things together, and strife brings disorder and chaos and separates things. And when these elements are, let's say, in love with one another, then you're gonna be seeing things that are combined and bring things into existence, or things are done through that. And then whenever there's strife and contention, they fall apart. He says necessarily the elements exist and will not stop existing. So in a certain way, he believes in an infinite universe, at least for these elements and their existence. If they're infinite, then the universe is infinite, which makes sense since he already believes that the world exists because of necessity, not contingency. Our next thinker is Anaxagoras, who taught that the sun is a red-hot stone and the moon is made of earth. He agrees with Parmenides about being neither coming out or going into existence. And he says in everything there's a portion of everything. This is how things change. This is a unique idea since everything exists within a thing. And whenever we see them changing, it's not really changing. They already contained that thing. So by stating this, he disagreed that change is an illusion. There is actual change, but it's contained within it. And he introduces the concept of the mind as the power behind all the elements. Now, nous, or mind, is an infinite self-ruled thing, and it is mixed with nothing. Remember that he thinks everything has something within it except the mind, except his nous. It's kind of a pure thing, if you can think of it in that sense. So it is alone, it is by itself, exists alone, self-existent. Now, he did consider this nous, or the mind, to be material. So he doesn't believe in the mind as being an immaterial thing, but rather a material thing. But he thinks that it is the thinnest of all material things. So he tries to reduce it to a point where it is, I guess, really close to being immaterial, but not really immaterial. The next individual is Protagoras. Now, Protagoras is a sophist, okay? So he believes that truth depends on perspective. Maybe in the modern sense of the word, we would say that Protagoras is a skeptic or a relativist. And he believed that truth depends on the perspective. Every argument, he said, has two sides. Now, you and I would agree that every argument has two sides. That's a very self-evident, obvious thing. Every argument does have a two side. But he said, since it has two sides, then both of those sides, depending on where the individual is standing, could be right. So he said he is famous for saying the statement that many of us have heard, that man is the measure of all things. So to Protagoras, nothing is inherently good in itself. And notice the relativism here. Something is ethical or right only because a person or society judge it to be so. So if your society judges it to be the case that it's okay to have slaves, then it's okay to have slaves. And if your society changes its mind on the subject, then it is no longer okay to have slaves. So, as you can tell, relativism is not something that is new to world history. And it's not something that is new, especially when it comes to Christian apologetics. Now, Christians didn't exist in the pre-Socratic period, but the sophists developed their schools and continue teaching these things. And when Christianity comes on the scene in 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, you get Christians preaching the gospel. They become familiar with the philosophical ideas of the sophists, and they actually interact with the sophists as well. Or that sort of thinking, you could say. Now, we're going to shift gears here from the pre-Socratic thinkers to looking at chapter 1 of Love Your God with All Your Mind, written by J.P. Moreland, and some of the ideas that he proposes. And one of the first things he deals with is how we lost the Christian mind and why we must recover it. There's been a loss of the Christian mind in the church today. It's part of the reason why you might be taking this course, is because you think there is a loss of the Christian mind and we need to recover it, and you're on a journey to recover it, or you just want to go deeper into it so that you would help your friends and your church community to recover it, so that you become a better and more bold witness for the gospel and for Jesus. Here are a couple of questions we can think about, or 4 questions we can think about. Has the church in general lost or neglected the ability to disciple the mind for Christ? Has the church neglected its ability to disciple the mind for Christ? Think about it. When we disciple people in our churches, most of the time we focus on their prayer life. We focus on how they should read the Bible. We don't even go into how they should study the Bible, but at least have a devotional life. Go to church, right? Do serve in the church. Maybe evangelize. But when was the last time we saw a rich discipleship program that had as a part of its curriculum an effort to develop the mind of the Christian? So have we neglected that? What is faith's relationship to reason? Even in the church, plenty of people think that there is no relationship between reason and faith. They think that if you have faith, then you no longer need reason. Or even worse, that if you have reason, then you no longer need faith. Somehow that eliminates the need for faith. And this is just not the case, because faith could be synonymously used with trust. So, and if you're going to trust someone, you're going to have reasons to trust that person. And this is true of God as well. So let's do a little exercise here. What images come to your mind when you hear the word secular? What images come to your mind when you hear the word sacred? We say this because there seems to be a dichotomy of sorts. Maybe people have pitted these ideas together, against each other, not together. That if something is secular, then it is not sacred. And if something is sacred, it is not secular. They are opposed to one another. And this might not necessarily be the case. Say I have a quote-unquote the way we speak about these things, a secular job, right? Where more in the biblical sense would be your job, whatever it is that you do, secular not necessarily being a negative connotation here, that say you're a mechanic, is sacred because God's called you to do that for a living, to support your family through that, and you get to minister to or serve your customers. And you ought to do that in a God-honoring, faithful way. And finally, you might want to think about, has secularism influenced the church in America? If secularism has influenced the church in America, how has it influenced the church in America? One of the things I said is this definition of faith and reason. It seems to me that this is secularism, or a secularist definition of faith, that it is unreasonable, that has come into the church. And individuals in the church have bought onto this, have believed it, and teach it to others. So when did this all start? When did this rise to anti-intellectualism start in the church? We see this separatists kind of ideology, mindset within the church, what we will call the pilgrims of the mid-19th century. And within that, we see a number of movements or awakenings or revivals. The first one is the first Great Awakening. And this was within 1730 to 1750, predominantly led by the great, amazing preacher, George Whitefield. The second Great Awakening we see is in the 1800s, 1800 to 1820. And then we see Charles Finney's revivals, 1824 to 37. See how these are closely related. I mean, technically we can say the second Great Awakening takes place from the early 1800s to the mid 1800s, because then we see the Layman's Prayer revival that's from 1956 to 1958. And the second Great Awakening, more than the first Great Awakening, could have been the result of, or as a result, it brought about these negative things that we see in the church. And let's not only talk about the negative stuff, let's talk about the positive stuff as well. And one of the positives is that there was a focus on personal conversions. There was preaching about giving your life to Jesus, converting to Christ, and following him. A negative of this would have been the experiences of the people without a foundation, without a proper biblical foundation. Okay? So people would have experiences, people would feel like God has spoken to them, God has given them a call. Maybe you've heard this term, like I've received a call or I have the call, most of the time that had to do with like going into ministry. And people would say, well, God's called me. Who can stop me? So I'm going to go and do ministry. Well, the problem is what? These individuals are untrained. So they would go and do ministry in places and teach incorrect doctrine and develop really false ideas. As a matter of fact, it is during this period of time where we see maybe the three most well-known American cults come into existence. And those are the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints, and also a movement called Christian Science. Moving on, we're going to see during these periods of time, there were intellectual assaults on Christianity. And we saw this in philosophy, and we saw this in the philosophy of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. And what they challenged was the relationship between sense perception and knowledge. So if the Christian was saying, well, I think God exists, I think angels are real, I think X, Y, and Z, this sort of philosophy would have attacked them and said, look, there is no sense perception of this stuff. So therefore, because there is no sense perception, because you can't see God and touch him and feel him and smell him, then you can't really say that you have knowledge about God. Couple this with the idea of what's called German higher criticism, which would have been a theological sort of attack. And German higher criticism predominantly focused on the text of the Bible and whether it's reliable and trustworthy or not, and brought a number of things into question. And then added on to this would have been Darwinian evolution. And now here we want to distinguish between non-Darwinian evolution, and there are different forms of it, but specifically here it's Darwinian evolution, that everything is material, that it's material causes that bring about the evolution of our species. And when people bought into Darwinian evolution, they no longer saw the need for God. And when you put all these things together, then there's an intellectual assault or attack on Christianity. And so some of this stuff has impacted the church in the following ways. There's a misunderstanding of faith. People think that faith is just unreasonable belief. Number two, there's a dichotomizing of the secular and the sacred. So doing things in the church or in ministry or serving the church, quote unquote, is to be considered sacred, and everything else that you do in your life is secular. This weakened world missions. It made the gospel irrelevant because now there's a separatist kind of anti-intellectual mindset behind it, and so the gospel is irrelevant. Because if I'm going to be a doctor and go study and learn and develop myself and practice these things and use my mind, use my brain to accomplish these things, but I'm going to go to church on Sunday and they're going to tell me that I need to put my mind and my brain aside, well, that makes the gospel irrelevant. As a result, that leads to a loss of the boldness for the Christian worldview or the Christian witness. Well, if you're not confident, if you don't know these things, and you can say you know these things, if something is predominantly reliant on your own feelings and experiences, you will not be as bold to express these ideas. And then there's a rise and influence of secularism generally in culture. And so as a result, we have a number of extremely fundamental words or ideas that are brought into question and given different definitions. So for example, this idea of living the good life, where the ancient philosophers spoke about this as well, spoke about a life, the ancient idea of living the good life would be a life of intellectual and moral virtue. Living a life according to the nature that God himself gave to us. Now this idea gets changed into the satisfaction of any pleasure or desire that someone freely and autonomously chooses for himself or herself. So what does it mean to live the good life? Well, as long as my pleasures are met, I'm living the good life. Where previously there was a richer understanding of what it meant to live the good life. And it had to do with moral virtue. It had to do with living a life that God intended for us to live. It was a part of the design of God. Number two, there's this concept of freedom. And maybe as Americans, we love freedom. We love the idea of freedom. We celebrate freedom. Well, there's a modern sense of the word and an ancient sense of the word. The modern sense of the word is the power to do what one wants to do. So I am free to do whatever I want to do. Therefore, I do it. That's what real freedom is, as long as you have the power to do whatever it is that you want to do. Where in the more traditional sense, it is the power to do what one ought to do. So there is a moral imperative here. It's not that you have the power to do something or you want to do something, but rather whether you ought to do it or not. Finally, there's this idea of tolerance. And in the modern sense, tolerance is the acceptance of all views as truth. No one is right and no one is wrong. If you're going to be tolerating people, you have to accept whatever their view is. Think about the modern conversation about LGBTQ issues. If you say anything against one of these ideas, then you are an intolerant bigot because you don't accept it. If you really want to be a tolerant individual, you would have to accept it. Now, this opposes a more traditional view of tolerance, and this is defending the right of another person to argue their view even though you, number one, think they are dead wrong, they are very wrong, or two, will argue fervently against them. But to be tolerant of them would mean that you would defend their right to say it, to argue their point. That's real tolerance. That's the way tolerance should be. But again, we have changed the definition of this word, and most people in our culture don't think about tolerance in the sense that I will defend you even though I disagree with you. There are some quotes that I think communicate some of these ideas very well. Now, this quote says the church is safe from vicious persecution at the hands of the secularists today. As educated people have finished with stake-burning circuses and torture racks, no martyr's blood is shed in the secular West. So long as the church knows her place and remains quietly at peace on her modern reservation. So let the babes pray and sing and read their Bibles, continuing steadfastly in their intellectual retardation. The church's extinction will come not by sword or pillory, but by the quiet death of irrelevance. But let the church step off the reservation. Let her penetrate once more the culture of the day, and the face of secularism will change from a benign smile to a savage snarl. This is very interesting. And this is what this course is all about. Training you to be able to penetrate the culture, step off the reservation. Now, there is a danger to that this benign smile will change and become a savage snarl. But we have put into this place where we can, as the church, do whatever we want to do as long as it's amongst us. But don't engage culture, don't make truth claims. And finally, here's what J.P. Moreland has to say. He says, if we're going to be wise, spiritual people prepared to meet the crisis of our age, we must be studying, learning community. Or we must be a studying, learning community that values the life of the mind. If you want your church to be a vibrant church, to be a community that is wise and spiritual, make sure that it is a studying and learning community. Finally, Sir William Drummond said, "He that will not reason is a bigot. He that cannot reason is a fool, and he that dares not reason is a slave." Too many people in the church are slaves. Too many people in the church dare not reason. They are terrified of reasoning. And the call we have as Christian apologists, the call we have as Christians is a call to love God with all of our minds, as well as all of our hearts and strength and soul. But the focus here is to love God with all of our mind. And in doing so, we will honor God and we will live our lives properly as Christians. Now, this was lesson 3 in an introduction to apologetics and philosophy. I want to thank you for joining us for this course and look forward to spending time with you. Don't ever forget that you have access to me. You can email me at info@apologiacenter.com and I will do my best to answer your questions. Take care and God bless.